The day Terror walked into McDonald's massacre. A single shot cracked like thunder inside the bright, ordinary McDonald's. Fries sizzled in the kitchen. A child laughed. Then Terror walked in. It was not just a man with guns, it felt like something colder and older, a shape that moved with the footsteps of the person who carried the weapons. People froze. Paper cups trembled. Light from the windows washed the booths in golden afternoon glow, but the glow could not warm the fear that filled the room. The gunman moved through the crowd, and every sudden sound became a shout of panic. Chairs scraped. A mother grabbed her child and pulled him down behind a table. An old man tried to stand and couldn't. People shouted for help, but words were swallowed by the thunder of more shots. The air smelled of hamburger grease and smoke and something metallic that made the chest ache. Some people crawled under tables, some climbed over counters, some lay perfectly still and held their breath like it might make them invisible. Outside, sirens sang. Inside, the world had narrowed to breaths, to the beating of hearts, to the way the lights hummed overhead. A boy named Tim, he was only 12, felt a cold hand against his ankle, but there was no one there. It was like a shadow had reached for him and passed through. He thought it was the breeze from the open door. Then the lights flickered, and for a moment the whole room seemed to be in a photograph, everything frozen, colors dull, faces like ghosts. Tim saw the shooter raise his weapon and, in the pale flash of the broken light, Tim saw something else walking beside the shooter, a darker outline that did not breathe, that did not blink. It leaned in close, as if whispering a promise. Tim could not move. He could not scream. He tasted salt and copper and the strange metallic fear of something that was not quite alive. Then a loud crack cut the hush. A police officer shouted over the radio. A sniper on a rooftop took steady aim. The entire restaurant held a single, fragile second, the kind of second that lives forever in people's minds. Just as the sniper's finger tightened on the trigger, the lights went out. Not a flicker this time, but black as if the sun had been swallowed. The sudden dark was not empty, it was heavy and close. Something cold brushed the chef's arm. A voice, no one could say where it came from, hissed something only half-formed. Tim felt hands that weren't hands lift him by his shirt and drag him backward into the shadow under a table. He could hear the rifle go off. He could hear a sound like a door slamming in a place where there was no door. And then the room was silent except for breathing and a low, slow sound that could have been a heartbeat, or a machine counting down. Right at that heartbeat, everything stopped in the middle of a scream. The chapter of the moment broke like glass and then, nothing. The rest of the moment ripped away from Tim's head and dissolved, as if it had never happened. He blinked and found himself sitting on the floor, safe under a table, while outside the sirens wove closer. But something was not right. Where the shooter had been, there was a ring of oil-dark shadow on the linoleum like spilled ink. It did not spread, it simply sat there, thick and hungry. Tim reached out with the tip of his finger, and the shadow recoiled like a living thing. A smell rose up, old rain and dust and something that belonged in caves. Tim wanted to cry, to run, to call for his mom, but his voice would not come. He remembered the flash of the rooftop rifle. He remembered the lights going out. He remembered hands that were not hands. And he remembered the whisper that had said his name. How could a boy alone under a table know his own name was being hissed by something that had no mouth? How could it know where he slept? How could it speak to him across the rubbled teeth of the world? Tim tried to tell himself it was his imagination, the shock and the fear and the bright colors of the restaurant mixing into a fever dream. But then a quiet woman next to him, Mrs. Alvarez, who worked at the solicitor's office, touched his shoulder. Her hand was trembling. She whispered that she had seen the same thing, a shadow that walked with the shooter. Her voice was a thread in the dark. She told Tim not to move. It listens to noise, she breathed. It drinks it. The two of them sat very still, and through the crack in the door they could see blue and red lights turn the parking lot into a pool of color. That was the moment when the world blinked back to the beginning, before the guns, before the whispering shadow, before the lights had died. It was the morning of July 18, 1984, and the McDonald's was bright and ordinary, full of people saying small, simple things. The man who would bring terror had woken up that morning like any other man. He had eaten breakfast, he had driven his car, and he had bought food from a store. There were no markings that would make anyone stop and point that morning. He looked like a man who could belong anywhere, a haircut that was neither neat nor wild, clothes that had been chosen without thought. People waved and smiled in a place where people waved and smiled. The McDonald's bustled with life. A teenage girl named Jenny was on her way to work a short afternoon shift, tying her hair into a ponytail and worrying about the math test she had tomorrow. An elderly customer, Mr. Hargrove, sat near the window and read a newspaper, his coffee cooling beside him. A family from across town shared a meal after a day at the beach. The clock on the wall moved in its steady, honest way. Outside, the sun made the windows sparkle, and a little boy chased a fly around his ketchup cup. Nobody imagined that any of it was fragile. Nobody expected the ordinary to break that day. As the morning slid into afternoon, there were small, quiet things that should have mattered. A neighbor asking about a lost dog, a boy dropping his burger, the fry cook humming under his breath. The man who would become the center of terror was seen by a few as he walked down the street. One person thought he looked tired, another thought he looked nervous, but there was no alarm. In a small convenience store, he had asked for directions and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. One clerk remembered the smile later and tried to tell herself it was nothing. The world did what it always did, it went on, full of small kindnesses and little mistakes. Inside the McDonald's, Jenny set down a tray and scanned the room with a practiced glance. A mother with two girls in a corner booth, a pair of men playing with a pocket radio, a man in a suit reading paper, laughter from the play area. The door chimed as new people came in. When the man entered later that afternoon, he walked slow at first, taking in the bright colors, the red and yellow that seemed to be saying everything would be okay. He ordered food. He did not seem dangerous. He seemed tired, like someone who had carried a heavy weight all day. For a long time he sat, eating quietly, looking at the people. No one knew that watching had become a kind of waiting, that the thing in him had been gathering itself like a storm. Some things grow inside people like weeds, slow and secret. In the last hour before the shot that split the room, there were little signs that something was wrong. The way he kept touching his coat, the way his hands trembled when he sipped his drink, the way his eyes kept returning to the exit as if he were counting it. If someone had put a hand on his shoulder and asked if he was okay, maybe he would have answered. But nobody did. The ordinary moments rolled forward like a train, and the train did not know it was about to crash. As the light outside turned toward evening, children finished their playtime and parents called them back to the tables. Jenny wiped a counter and laughed at something on the radio. Mr. Hargrove folded his paper and reached for his cane. No one was ready for the cold step that would enter the room. No one was ready for the whisper that would come with the noise. The door chimed again, and a shadow fell across the floor, one shadow among many. Then terror walked in. Back in the present under the table, Tim squeezed Mrs. Alvarez's hand until he heard her gasp. For a moment, the two of them let their memories of ordinary moments hold them like a small, warm blanket. They could not know what the next second would bring. Would the lights come back? Would someone outside reach the shooter? Would the shadow leave when the floor was stained with its dark ring? Then a scraping sound came from the kitchen, soft and slow, like something being dragged. It was a simple noise, but in that place it was a drumbeat that grew louder and louder inside their heads. The scrape was not the shoes of a rushing policeman. It was not the careful step of paramedics. It was a slow, measured stroke that spelled a name. The scrape stopped right beside the counter where the spilled shadow lay. A tiny, small voice, too small and too close, whispered, "Tim." The boy held his breath until he thought he might shatter. Mrs. Alvarez's fingers tightened. Outside, the siren's song raised and then dipped. The darkness under the table seemed to breathe. Tim wanted to crawl away. He wanted to run out into the lights. He wanted the whole thing to be a bad dream he could wake from. But the voice came again, clearer now, and with it came the smell of old rain and caves. "Tim." The whisper sounded like his name had been carved on a cold stone. The chapter closed on that sound, and everything went very, very still. Tim. The name slid through the dark like a pebble dropped into still water. Tim felt it vibrate along his bones. He wanted to reply, to tell whatever it was to go away, but Mrs. Alvarez's hand on his shoulder pressed a tiny warning, "Do not make noise." They stayed like that, two small shapes under a table, while the room around them breathed and waited. Outside, the police voices were different now, softer, careful. Someone called for medics. Footsteps moved like rain across the parking lot. A radio sputtered from a police jacket, calm voices giving calm orders. The scrape that had been near the counter faded again, as if it had never been a scrape at all but only a memory someone had placed in the air. Tim told himself that the whisper might be a trick his mind played on him, that fear makes small things large. But fear is honest, and it remembers things the rest of us try to forget. The first quiet minutes were the hardest. Tim counted heartbeats to keep from making a sound. He watched the shadows curve where the light came through the glass. He smelled coffee and burnt fries and the sharp chemical smell of cleaning fluid. Mrs. Alvarez hummed very softly, a tune from her childhood, and the sound seemed to sew a small blanket of comfort around them. The blue and red lights outside made the wall glow like a broken toy. Slowly, slowly, people began to move. A paramedic crawled under a nearby table and checked a shoulder, a knee, a pulse. The world returned in pieces. Someone helped him crawl out. The sunlight outside looked different, washed with a color that did not belong there, but the air tasted of relief. Jenny, the teenager who had been working the counter, sat on the curb and let the sun warm her face. She held a paper napkin against her cheek and watched the police tape flutter like a blue ribbon around the parking lot. Mr. Hargrove clung to his cane as if it were an anchor. Mrs. Alvarez kept glancing at Tim, her eyes like small wet stones. They spoke in whispers that sounded too loud in their ears. Names were said. A prayer was said. Someone handed Tim a paper cup of water. He drank and felt the cool slide down his throat. He wanted to scream for it all to end, but the scream stayed a stone lodged without a mouth. Later, at the hospital, doctors and nurses moved with a careful urgency. People were stitched and tested and told to wait. The TV in the hospital lobby told pieces of the story in soft, newsreader voices. "A man opened fire," the anchor said. The words were the same as the ones Tim had heard in the restaurant, but when the story left the room, it sounded flatter, easier to hold. The word 21 came like a number on a bus, far, and yet it meant someone's brother, someone's child. Tim's mother held him in the waiting room and smelled of shampoo and worry. She would not let go for hours. In the days that followed, the town learned to hold its breath a little less tightly. Friends came with casseroles and blankets. People put flowers and stuffed animals at the gate of the demolished McDonald's, right where the windows had been. The owners of the store locked the door, and then they tore the building down. A quiet place grew there later, grass, a bench, a small plaque with names. The town called it a memorial park. It was meant to be a place to remember the people who had been lost and to hold the quiet like a promise. But quiet can be heavy. It can press on the ears like a pillow. It can also hide things that wait until no one is looking. Tim grew, but the memory stayed small and bright inside him like a scar that glows at the cold. He got older and tried to fold that day into the pages of his life. He went to school, tried to make jokes, learned to tie his shoes without looking. He visited the park with his mom on a Sunday. He sat on the bench and traced letters with his finger on the plaque. The names felt like stones in a river. He could still feel the whispers sometimes at the back of his neck, as faint as a moth. But the world gave him soft things to hold, friends, homework, a dog named Max. The dark did not matter so much in the daylight. Mrs. Alvarez came back to visit the memorial sometimes. She brought a small pot of white flowers and left them by the bench. She would sit for a while and talk to people who came by, telling them that the community was a net. When one fell, the net held them. She never used the word shadow. In public, she did not want to frighten people with a story that might sound like a dream. But to Tim, She would sometimes lean close and say, "It listens to noise, Niño. It remembers voices." Tim would nod and hand her a napkin, the same careful exchange of two people who had been saved by the same small miracle. Years went by, and the world kept moving. But sometimes, at night when the rain made the windows sing, Tim would hear a noise that was not a noise. It would be a scrape, a small whisper that sounded like his name, a breath that did not come from any mouth. He would sit up, heart thumping, and listen to the house settle. His mother would sleep again. The dog would sigh. The whisper would fade like fog. Tim learned to breathe through it. He learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to go on anyway. One evening, on the 15th anniversary of the tragedy, the town held a small ceremony at the park. Candles were lit. People spoke softly about bravery and kindness. Tim stood near the plaque with others who had been children then. He looked at the names and felt the weight of the years. A woman who had been a young mother that day hugged her daughter and cried. A firefighter who had answered the call put his hand on the plaque. They all promised to keep the memory safe. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups. The air smelled of candle wax and wet grass. Tim and Mrs. Alvarez walked slowly among the gravestones of memory, and for a while the world felt stitched together. They talked about ordinary things: the weather, the dog that used to chase birds, the new grocery store on Main Street. At the edge of the park, a small boy kicked a soccer ball and laughed, and the laugh was a bright bell in the night. Tim smiled. It was the sort of night that could heal. But then the lights along the walkway went out. Not all at once, just one, then another, like stars snuffed in a pattern. People looked up, puzzled. A low wind moved through the trees. It was a small thing, and people said it was probably a storm rolling in. Tim watched the shadows lengthen and join, and in the dark between two lights, he thought he saw a shape move. It was a slip of darker darkness at the edge of the bench, like an oil stain shifting in the grass. A child near the plaque called out to his father. The voice was bright, but the air pressed around it as if wrapping it in fabric. The world seemed to thin at the edges, and the whisper came again, very faint at first, like a radio catching a lost station. Tim felt his skin go cold. He tried to tell himself it was only the wind. The man from the monument put his hand on the child's shoulder. Mrs. Alvarez's fingers found Tim's and squeezed. "Do you hear it?" she asked, though it sounded more like a question that was already answered. Tim nodded. The whisper rolled through the grass and tasted of old rain. It said a name that was not Tim's, a name he had never heard. The lights along the path went out one by one until the park was a planet of small, trembling candles. The candles flickered, and then they did something Tim had never seen. They bent their flames toward the bench where the plaque sat. The breeze stopped. The laughter stopped. The boy's soccer ball stilled in the grass like a trapped insect. A shadow rolled across the letters on the plaque. It moved like a slow hand, reading the names as if it could learn them. Tim felt the hairs on his arm rise. He tried to call out, to wake someone, to break the circle of silence that this thing liked, but his voice would not come. The whisper shaped a name and then another, and with each name the air grew thicker. The last candle went dark. The park was not empty, it was full of watching. In that heavy, black moment, Tim understood the truth with a sudden, bright pain. The thing that had walked into the McDonald's had not been stopped by glass or by bullets. It had only been made quiet for a while. It had learned the sound of names. It had learned how to listen. And now, on an ordinary night wrapped in memory, it was learning new ones. A sound like 100 tiny feet began to move through the grass, coming from every direction at once. The story closed on that sound, a soft, terrible clattering that could be 1,000 whispers marching, and everyone at the memorial stood frozen as the air filled with names that were not theirs, and something cold leaned close and hummed each one. The sound in the grass grew louder, like tiny fingers tapping on the earth. The people at the memorial stood frozen, their faces lit only by the pale moon. Tim felt Mrs. Alvarez trembling beside him. The shadow near the plaque pulsed, swelling and shrinking like a living heart made of darkness. Then the whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't calling a name. It was asking one. Why, remember? The question rolled through the park like a cold wind. The candles tried to relight themselves and sputtered into nothing. The darkness wanted an answer. It wanted to know why humans insisted on holding the memory of that terrible day so tightly, why they carved names into stone and whispered stories each year. Tim swallowed hard. His voice was small, but his fear was bigger. Because they mattered, he said. The shadow stopped moving. They mattered, he said again, louder this time. The people who were lost. The people who survived. The people who helped. They mattered. And they still matter. A low rumble passed through the park, like distant thunder. The darkness swirled, twisting and stretching across the grass. It rose up taller than a person, taller than the trees, trying to understand the weight of those words. Tim stepped forward, despite his shaking legs. Mrs. Alvarez tried to grab him, but he gently pulled away. You don't get to take their names, Tim said. They belong to the world. They belong to their families. They belong to history. Not to you. The shadow recoiled. For the first time, it looked uncertain, like a creature made from all the fear and sorrow left behind, suddenly confused by something stronger than itself. Then something happened that no one expected. A single candle flickered back to life. Just one. Its tiny flame stood straight and bright as if refusing to bow to the dark. Another candle sparked. Then another. Soon the whole row of candles on the memorial glowed again, lighting the plaque with soft, golden warmth. The shadow hissed, shrinking away from the light. The names carved in metal shimmered. The whispering stopped. The crawling noise in the grass faded like dust blowing away. And the darkness pulled back toward the memorial bench, curling into itself like smoke returning to a chimney. It gave one final shiver, a long, low hum that sounded almost like a sigh, and then broke apart into a burst of dull ash that scattered on the wind. The park fell quiet. The crowd slowly began to breathe again as if they had forgotten how. A police officer blinked and looked around, confused. A child picked up his soccer ball. Mrs. Alvarez let out a shaky laugh that turned into tears. She hugged Tim tightly. You did it, she said. You broke its hold. Tim didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had finally spoken the words he'd carried inside for years. But the park felt lighter now. Even the air felt warm again, as if the night itself had been waiting for someone to speak the truth aloud. In the following weeks, the story of the strange night in the memorial park spread quietly through the town. People whispered about shadows and candles and the way the air had felt too heavy to breathe. But the official reports talked only about flickering lights from a passing storm and frightened memories stirred up by an emotional anniversary. Only the people who had been there knew the deeper truth. And they guarded it gently. As for Tim, he would grow older, go to college, get a job, and someday bring his own children to the memorial park. He would teach them what he had learned that night, that remembering is a kind of light, and that even the darkest things cannot survive where light refuses to die. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind moved just right, he thought he could still hear something, not a whisper this time, but a soft, distant hush, like a shadow finally learning how to sleep. The end.